214 years. That's all that remains according to ancient Jewish calculations. 214 years until the Hebrew year 6000, the moment when, according to the Talmud, Midrash and Zohar, the Messiah must appear. But here's what's making rabbis around the world hold emergency meetings. We're not just counting down to year 6000, we're living in year 5786, and according to Jewish scholars, we've just entered what they call the eve of the Sabbath, the final hours before the most significant event in human history. And for the first time in 2000 years, everything required for that event is now in place. Because on July 1st, 2025, something happened that hasn't occurred since 70 AD. On a remote hilltop in northern Israel, flames consumed a red heifer in an ancient purification ceremony. Texas businessman Byron Stinson, who spent years and $700,000 searching for these biblically perfect animals, watched as 2,000 years of waiting culminated in fire and ash. But this wasn't the official ceremony. This was the practice run. The Temple Institute confirmed that preparations for the actual ritual are still underway. And when it happens, when those ashes are ready, the countdown to the third temple begins. The question isn't if anymore. The question is when. And more importantly, are we ready for what comes next? Let me take you back 5,586 years according to the Hebrew calendar, to the very beginning. Jewish tradition places creation at 3761 BC. Every year since then has been meticulously counted, recorded, and interpreted through a prophetic lens that most of the world has ignored. But Jewish rabbis never stopped counting. They never stopped watching, and they never forgot what was written in Psalms 94. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by. 6 days of creation, 6,000 years of human history, and then the seventh day, the Sabbath rest of the Messianic age. Rabbi Katina declared in the Babylonian Talmud, 6,000 years the world will exist, and 1,000 the seventh it shall be destroyed. Just as the seventh year is the Sabbath year, so too does the world have 1,000 years out of 7 that are fallow. Maimonides, one of Judaism's greatest medieval scholars, wrote that the 6th millennium will see the coming of the Messiah, and the 7th millennium will be the world to come, when the righteous are resurrected and rejoice. Maimonides, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the Lubavitcher, Rebbe Menachem Mendel, Schneerson, all taught variations of this same prophetic timeline, 6,000 years until the Messiah. We are now in year 5786, but here's where it gets urgent. The Lubavitcher Rebbe taught that just as Jews prepare for Sabbath several hours before sunset on Friday, humanity should prepare for the Messianic age before the year 6000 arrives. He calculated that by the Hebrew year 5750, which was 1989 to 1990, we had reached the equivalent of Friday at 12:51 p.m. The millennial clock was 3/4 finished. That was 35 years ago. We're now at approximately 2:30 p.m. on the millennial Friday. The sun is setting, the Sabbath approaches, and there's no more time for delay. Rabbi Yaakov Kuli wrote in Miam Loez, "In earlier times, the redemption was far in the future. Therefore, in order for their prayers to have any effect, people had to pray intensely. Now, however, we are only 500 or 200 years away from the time, and the closer it comes, the easier it is for prayers to be accepted." That was written in 1732. He was saying prayers were more powerful because the deadline was approaching. What would he say today, when we're down to 214 years, when signs that seemed impossible for centuries are now appearing on the evening news? Because that's exactly what's happening. On Tisha B'Av 2025, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, commemorating the destruction of both temples, Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir did something unprecedented. He ascended the Temple Mount, openly prayed, prostrated himself, and led thousands in worship at Judaism's holiest site. For the first time in modern history, a sitting Jewish minister publicly worshipped where the temples once stood. Israeli officials insisted nothing has changed, but everyone watching knew everything has changed. The status quo is dead. The Temple Mount is no longer off-limits, and what was unthinkable yesterday is becoming policy today. Prophecy News Watch published an analysis with a headline that should make every person pause. Prophecy in motion, dramatic changes on the Temple Mount point to new era. The article stated, "What happened on Tisha B'Av 2025 is not merely political theater, it is a seismic moment in Israel's spiritual awakening. What was once a dream, the return of the temple, feels nearer than ever." Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, founder of the Temple Institute, argues passionately that worship must be restored directly on the Temple Mount, not just at the Western Wall. And the Temple Institute isn't just talking. They've prepared nearly everything needed for temple construction, including a massive golden menorah valued at $6 million, priestly garments, sacred vessels, altar blueprints, training programs for Levitical priests. And then there are the Red Heifers. In July 2025, for the first time in 2,000 years, a practice Red Heifer ceremony was conducted. Byron Stinson, the Texas rancher who found 5 qualifying heifers, explained the biblical requirements. The animal must be entirely red, with no more than 2 non-red hairs, never used for labor, never bred, with no flaws or blemishes. Out of roughly 900,000 cattle slaughtered daily worldwide, finding even one that meets these specifications is nearly impossible. Yet 5 were found in Texas, approved by 5 rabbis, and transported to Israel in 2022. As of early 2025, 3 have developed disqualifying marks, but 2 remain under observation. 2 perfect red heifers waiting for the moment when their ashes will purify the priesthood and sanctify the temple site. Numbers 19 lays out the requirements with mathematical precision. The red heifer must be slaughtered, burned completely, and its ashes mixed with water to create purification water for those who will serve in the temple. Without this ceremony, temple service cannot begin. Without temple service, prophecy cannot be fulfilled. For 2,000 years, this seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. How could sacrifices resume without a temple? How could a temple be built without purification? How could purification happen without a red heifer? The circle seemed unbreakable, until 5 calves were born in Texas, until Israeli rabbis confirmed their qualification. Until a practice ceremony proved the ritual could be performed. The circle is breaking. The countdown has begun. But let's address the controversy head-on, because not all rabbis agree on what should happen next. Orthodox Judaism has been divided for centuries on whether Jews should actively rebuild the temple or wait for the Messiah to do it supernaturally. After the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, most rabbis adopted the position that Jewish law prohibits reconstructing the temple prior to the Messianic age. The trauma was too deep, the fear of another catastrophe too great. Better to wait for divine intervention than risk human failure again. This became the dominant view for nearly 2,000 years. Jews prayed next year in Jerusalem, but didn't actually plan to rebuild until now. A new generation of rabbis is challenging that ancient consensus. They point to Israel's miraculous rebirth in 1948, the recapture of Jerusalem in 1967, the unprecedented return of Jews from every nation on earth, and they ask, if God has orchestrated all of this against impossible odds, isn't it time to stop waiting and start building? Rabbi Shlomo Goren, former chief rabbi of the Israel Defense Forces, began organizing public Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount immediately after the 1967 Six-Day War. He understood that holding the physical location meant nothing if Jews weren't spiritually reclaiming it. His vision, considered radical in 1967, is now becoming mainstream in 2025. Younger rabbis, trained in yeshivas that actually study the biblical texts rather than just rabbinic commentary, are discovering what their ancestors knew. God commanded the temple. God gave the blueprints. God specified the sacrifices. If the opportunity exists, isn't refusal to build actually disobedience? Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, stated publicly in 2018 at the Aretz Sheva conference in Jerusalem, "There's no reason why the miracle of the re-establishment of the temple on the Temple Mount is not possible." In 2019, he ascended the Temple Mount with Rabbi Chaim Richman of the Temple Institute. This isn't fringe thinking anymore. This is official American policy being shaped by individuals who take biblical prophecy seriously. And when Bishop Alan Didio visited the Temple Institute personally, he was stunned by what he found. Everything prepared, priests identified, training completed, designs finalized. When asked how long construction would take once approved, the answer was specific: 3.5 years, exactly the time frame mentioned in biblical prophecy for the first half of the tribulation period. Daniel 9:27 prophesied that a ruler would confirm a covenant with many for 7 years. In the middle of that 7-year period, at the 3.5-year mark, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. For sacrifices to end, they must first begin. For them to begin, there must be a temple. For a temple to be built, there must be peace sufficient to allow construction. We're watching every piece fall into place. Trump's peace accord signed in October 2025. The Temple Institute's preparations complete. Red heifers ready for sacrifice. Rabbis debating not if, but when. The prophetic dominoes are lined up. One push, and they all fall. But here's what keeps me awake at night. The Hebrew year 5786 isn't just any year. Rabbinical scholars are calling it the year of stretching to connect, the year when heaven and earth converge, when what was separated begins to rejoin. The Hebrew letters that compose 5786 carry prophetic weight. Vav, the letter representing the number 6, is pictured as a hook or tent peg, something that connects two things, that pulls them together. Ezekiel 38:4, God declares, "I will put hooks into your jaws and pull you out," speaking of forcing Gog to invade Israel. The same letter that means connection also means compulsion. Something is being hooked, something is being pulled into position. Nations, events, prophecies, all converging on Jerusalem. And Jewish prayers reflect this urgency. Jews have ended Passover Seders and Yom Kippur fasts for 2,000 years with the cry, "Next year in Jerusalem." But now many are revising that prayer to say, "Next year on the Temple Mount," next year the third temple. The shift from longing to expectation is palpable. Charisma magazine reported in June 2025, in what many see as a prophetic fulfillment of end-time scripture, a significant shift is underway in Jerusalem. An increasing number of Jews are moving away from praying exclusively at the Western Wall and instead heading directly to the Temple Mount. This isn't theoretical anymore. Jews are physically reclaiming the Mount. Through prayer, through presence, through persistent public worship, despite political backlash, the Temple Mount matters. Its fate affects everyone on earth. Because Revelation 11:1-2 shows the Apostle John a vision of the Temple Mount during the final 3.5 years before Christ's return. He's told to measure the temple, implying a physical structure will exist, while the outer court is given to Gentiles who will trample it for 42 months. This prophecy requires a rebuilt temple, not a symbolic, not a spiritual metaphor, an actual building with an outer court and an inner court, with sacrifices and priests, with the Dome of the Rock somehow coexisting alongside or replaced by Jewish worship. The political and religious impossibility of this scenario is precisely why it's prophetically significant. When it happens, and the signs suggest it will, No one will be able to claim it was human planning. It will be divine orchestration forcing events toward their appointed conclusion. So, where does this leave us? The Hebrew year 5786, the year 2025 in the Gregorian calendar, 214 years until the Hebrew year 6000. But rabbis teach that the Messiah must come before year 6000, not at year 6000. Some calculate the deadline as year 5990, just 204 years away. Others point to the missing years debate, the controversy among Jewish scholars about whether 165 years were somehow lost in historical calculations. If that's true, if we're actually closer to year 6000 than the traditional calendar suggests, then the urgency multiplies exponentially. We might not have 214 years, we might have decades or less. Israeli scholar Dr. Carl Broggi, speaking on Stand in the Gap Radio in April 2025, described communications between Israeli religious and civil leaders and Donald Trump regarding a joint declaration or seeking the president's assistance in helping to establish and legitimize the right of Israel to space on the Temple Mount for the purpose of rebuilding a third temple and the beginning of animal sacrifice. Let that sink in. Official diplomatic channels discussing temple construction, not in theoretical future, in present tense, with current world leaders. The conversation has moved from synagogue study sessions to presidential briefings, from ancient texts to modern policy, from prophecy to planning. And this is where followers of Jesus must pay attention. Because while Jewish scholars debate whether this temple will usher in their Messiah, Christians who study prophecy recognize something darker. Daniel 9:27, Matthew 24:15, 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4. These passages describe not just a temple, but what happens inside it, the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist setting himself up in God's temple, declaring himself to be God. The Jewish people, hoping for redemption through their Messiah, will instead face the greatest betrayal in history when the one they trusted as their deliverer reveals himself as their destroyer. This is why Jesus warned in Matthew 24:15-21, "When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again." The temple the Jewish people are preparing to build will become the stage for Earth's darkest hour. Not because the temple is evil, not because their intentions are wrong, but because prophecy declares it will happen. The Antichrist will use their hope as his platform. He will use their sacred space for his ultimate blasphemy. And when he breaks the covenant in the middle of the 7 years, when he stops the sacrifices and demands worship, the Great Tribulation begins. Revelation describes those 3.5 years as worse than anything humanity has ever experienced. 1/3 of mankind killed by war, seas turned to blood, sun scorching people with fire, darkness so thick people gnaw their tongues in agony. This isn't metaphor. This is the price of rejecting the true Messiah when he came the first time. But here's the hope that transcends the horror. The same rabbinical teachings that describe the 6,000-year countdown also describe what comes after, the 7th millennium, the Messianic Sabbath, the world to come. Rashi wrote, "The world is decreed to last for 6,000 years. As the days of the week, the 7th day of the week is Sabbath. So too in the 7th millennium there will be tranquility in the world." Maimonides taught that the 7th millennium will be a time when the righteous are resurrected and rejoice, when the Messiah rules, when peace finally comes. The Jewish sages got the timeline right. They got the mathematics right. They got the signs right. What they missed, what most still miss, is the identity of the Messiah. He already came. In the Hebrew year 3793, at exactly the moment Daniel prophesied, Jesus rode into Jerusalem. They rejected him. They crucified him, and the 2,000-year countdown that followed has been humanity's slow march toward the moment when every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The Hebrew year 5786 is the year of connection, the year when heaven and earth stretch toward each other, the year when hooks are set and nations are pulled into position. Jewish scholars are right to sense urgency. They're right to prepare. They're right to watch for their Messiah. But the one they're waiting for is the one their ancestors rejected. And when he returns, not as the suffering servant this time, but as the conquering king, it won't be to dedicate a temple built by human hands. It will be to establish a kingdom that will never end. Revelation 21:22 says of the New Jerusalem, "I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple." The third temple in earthly Jerusalem will stand for only 7 years. The eternal temple in the New Jerusalem will stand forever. And everyone who has rejected the cornerstone the builders rejected will find themselves crushed when that stone falls. So what do you do with this information? First, understand the times. We are living in the most prophetically significant period since Jesus walked the earth. The Hebrew calendar is counting down. The temple preparations are complete. The political pieces are in place. Red heifers are ready. Rabbis are debating timing, not a possibility. Everything is converging on Jerusalem. Second, examine your relationship with the Jewish Messiah. Not your religion, not your church attendance, not your family tradition, your actual standing before the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because when the third temple is dedicated, when sacrifices begin, when the Antichrist reveals himself, there will be no middle ground. Revelation 13:8 says, "Everyone will worship him whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life." The Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Either your name is written there, or it isn't. Either you belong to Jesus, or you belong to the coming deception. Third, share this message. Not to create fear, not to promote date setting, but because people you love need to understand what's coming. The Jewish people need to hear that their Messiah already came, that he died for their sins, that he rose from the dead, and that he's coming back. Your family members need to know that the countdown is real, that the signs are undeniable, that time is running out. 214 years sounds like a long time, but prophecy students know that the Messiah comes before year 6000. And if the missing years theory is correct, we might already be past year 5950. The margin for error is shrinking. The window of grace is closing, and every day that passes without repentance is a day closer to judgment. The rabbis are right about one thing. We're on the eve of the Sabbath. The sun is setting on the 6th millennium. The 7th day approaches. But the Sabbath rest they're expecting isn't what's coming first. First comes the tribulation. First comes the Antichrist. First comes the abomination of desolation in their long-awaited temple. First comes the worst suffering humanity has ever known. And only after those 7 years of hell on earth does the true Sabbath begin, when Jesus returns, defeats his enemies at Armageddon, and establishes his kingdom. That's the hope. That's the promise. That's what lies beyond the countdown. But between now and then, every person must choose. Will you accept the Jewish Messiah now, while there's still time? Or will you wait until it's too late, until the deception is so strong that 2 Thessalonians 2:11 says, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie? The final stage is approaching. The countdown continues. The Hebrew year 5786 is stretching to connect heaven and earth. Are you ready for what comes next? Choose wisely. The clock is ticking.